Okay, this is lecture number 8. In this lecture, we'll deal with the Great Depression. And I want to start off a little bit by discussing the election of 1928 and what took place here, and then a little bit about what caused the Depression itself here in this time period. In 1928, Calvin Coolidge decides that he will not run for a second term. Remember, he completed the presidency or the election of Mr. Harding. Then he ran and got 4 years of his own. And he could have gone ahead and ran for another 4 years, but decided to go home. Calvin Jr. had died from blood poisoning, and him and his wife decided to go back to Massachusetts. And the man who runs the presidency in 1920 and 1928 is going to be Mr. Herbert Hoover. Mr. Hoover is well known to the American people. Number one, he is your first millionaire president. He was born in Iowa. He's the first president who's born across the Mississippi River system. And Mr. Hoover was educated in California. He had studied at Stanford University in California, became a well-known engineer. And he spent time in New Zealand. He spent time in Australia. He spent time in China and Japan. And when World War I broke out, he was working in Belgium. And he comes home during World War I, and Mr. Wilson will put him in charge of the Food and Fuel Division. And then, of course, he's selected by President Harding to be the head of the new Commerce Commission, and that's where he's at when the time comes for him to run for the presidency. And Mr. Coolidge pretty much helped Mr. Hoover get into the position here. Mr. Hoover, of course, will get the nomination from the Republican Party to run for the presidency here in 1928. Also running for the president as a Democrat is going to be Mr. Alfred Smith. Mr. Smith had grown up in New York City. His father was a newly arrived immigrant. Mr. Smith was born shortly after his father arrived in America, and so he is an Irish American. Mr. Smith is going to get his political career kicked off by being part of Tammany Hall. He comes out of the labor reform movement, and he was part of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And in 1920, he's elected as the governor of New York. So Mr. Smith is a he's a Democratic candidate for the presidency. He gets his bearings from New York City from working in the reform movement, and Mr. Hoover gets his teeth cut by working in various departments in the federal government here, starting as early as 1918. And both men are very capable men. Both men would do really well in the presidency. Now, the fate of these two men are going to depend upon the radio. In 1920, for the first time, the American people will hear their candidates talk about themselves and their plan for the country over the radio. Mr. Hoover has a dark, natural, baritone voice, very Midwestern voice. The way he pronounces his words and so forth are very immaculate. Mr. Smith, however, has a high Irish voice, and he doesn't sound as much presidential on the radio as Mr. Hoover does in this time period. But both men spent a lot of time going across the country campaigning, trying to get the vote for the presidency. Okay, Mr. Hoover is going to come out on top, and that's what's important in our program here, in our lecture here about Mr. Hoover. Mr. Hoover is a very capable man. Now, Mr. Hoover has just made headlines across the country in 1927. In 1927, the United States had a major flood take place on the Mississippi River system. It's called the Great Flood of 1927. This great flood was caused because of a large amount of snowfall that took place in the Great Plains in the winter of 1927. It snowed as much as 40 inches in some places along the Missouri River system. Also, on the eastern side, on the Ohio River system, you're going to have lots of rainfall that takes place in the winter of 1927. So between the rainfall and the snow melt, here in the spring of 1927, the river is going to flood. It's going to flood all the way down to New Orleans. It's going to be a major, major flood. Down below Memphis, however, the levees break. Now, these levees were all created after the American Civil War. The Corps of Engineers had come in after the Civil War and had built levees up and down the eastern side of the Great River system. And these levees did not hold here in the flood of 1927. Below Memphis is where the levees break. They break down toward Greenville, Mississippi. And when the levees break, the entire Mississippi Delta system is going to be flooded. Okay, now this delta runs between Belzoni, Mississippi, which is just north of Jackson, to just south of Memphis, Tennessee. And here in Mississippi, on the east side of the Mississippi River system, a big lake is formed. This lake goes from almost Interstate 55, or Interstate 55, back to the river. Is that 55, Interstate 55 or 59? I can't remember now. But it goes from Belzoni, Mississippi, all the way to Clarksdale, Mississippi, and back over toward the interstate system. You're going to have close to 100,000 square miles of flooded land here in this area, because it's going to encompass not only the Mississippi Delta, it's going to encompass parts of Arkansas and also parts of Louisiana. It's going to be a major flood area here in this region. This flood is going to displace the people of the Delta. The wealthier white folks are rescued here by motorboat and are brought to safety either in Jackson or in Memphis. The poor whites and the poor blacks who lived out here, the sharecroppers, are left behind. They're going to spend several weeks sitting on top of houses with floodwaters 15 feet deep around them. And a lot of people died during this flood period waiting for relief here. The owners of this farmland do not want these people removed because they're afraid if these people go to a new location, they will not come back to be their sharecroppers. Mr. Hoover is put in charge of the relief effort here in the Delta during this great flood. And what they decided to do, after 2 weeks of these people waiting around here on their rooftops with dead animals floating all around their houses, and the place was just a total sewage mess, a place of death and destruction, they finally came in with rowboats and rescued the poor whites and the poor black families out of the Delta. And they moved them to the levees that were still standing. They did not remove them to a safe area. And they brought in food and medical supplies and so forth, trying to take care of these people who were actually trapped here in this flood. Okay? Alexander Percy wrote a book. He's out of Greenville, Mississippi. Mr. Percy wrote a book that's called Lanterns on the Levee that deals with the relief here that took place here with Mr. Hoover. All right, this attempt toward FEMA was extremely slow. And a lot of people died because the federal government did not work in a fast manner to help these people out. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, the same thing took place. The poor people of New Orleans were left behind. The wealthier people, the middle class people, had all left on their own by motor car or by buses that left the city. But these people had no way out. And they were trapped in their houses, on their rooftops, on Interstate 10's bridges across New Orleans, and of course in the convention center and over in the Astrodome. When I saw the people in New Orleans in 2005, after this hurricane hit the city, I thought, my God, we have not changed events since 1927. The same people are in dire strait. The same number of people died here. We had not learned our lesson. So the flood of 1927 that went across the Mississippi Delta region into Arkansas and Louisiana was a major natural disaster. And Herbert Hoover was put in charge of it. And of course, the newspaper gave them false news, gave fake news across the country where people were actually dying and were hurting, were starving to death. They were not even being mentioned in the reports here in this time period. As a matter of fact, the city of New Orleans was threatened to be flooded in this great flood. And so they decided, the United States federal government decided, the best way to save New Orleans is to blast out the levees on the west side of the river and those southern Acadian parishes of Louisiana. And these folks down here on the west bank of New Orleans were told that they're going to go through and blast out the levees. Their homeland, their homes, their property, their towns would be totally destroyed, but they would be being reimbursed and they would be rebuilt. And they blew them out. They blew up the levees on that west side of New Orleans. And all that flood water went across the Canadian parishes down into the Gulf. But the people were not rebuilt, and the people in this area were not reimbursed for their losses. They were lied to by the federal government. So you start seeing major issues taking place here with this flood of 1927. And I want to tell you something. That flood of 1927 played a major role in going to the Great Depression, and the problems in New Orleans in 2005 played a major role into our economic downturn in 2007. So there's a lot of similarities between the Depression being started in the late 1920s and the Great Recession that took place in the early years of the 21st century. And there's a lot of similarities between these two events here that takes place. Okay, now Mr. Hoover is elected your president, and Mr. Hoover decides that he has the power, that he can run a good federal government, and that the nation will be in okay shape. He does not know of the disaster heading his way. He takes the oath of office on March the 4th, 1929. By the end of October of 1929, we are in the Great Depression. Wall Street has fallen apart. The financial institutions have collapsed. The banking system has collapsed. The housing market has collapsed. There's all kinds of problems across Europe that's going to lead to the collapse of the economy. Okay? And the farmers are in a depression during this time period. So the Depression just didn't happen. They were not paying attention to what was going on here in America during this time period. Okay, the same thing happened in 2007. The same exact thing happened in 2007. Okay, you know, everybody calls the problem in 2007 the Great Recession. It was a depression, and we're still in the depression here. And in 2021, 2022 time period, we're still in this depression here. And the pandemic has not helped any in us getting out of this depression here in our time period. Okay, now when Mr. Smith resigns the office of governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt decides to run for the governorship of New York. And I want to talk a little bit here about this president here, or this governor here of New York in this time period. Mr. Roosevelt was born in the late 1870s. He was born into a household of privilege. His father was extremely wealthy, but he was an older man. His mother was in her 20s when he was born. At age 8 years old, his father died, and his mother took over his life. Most boys, when they turn 8, 9, 10 years old, will go to a prep school getting ready to go to college. Mother would not let him go. She refused to let her son go to a prep school. Sarah Roosevelt decided that she should keep her son at home. He did not have playmates of his own age. The people he associated with were all adults. The young kid did not have a childhood. Finally, at age 12, she allowed him to go to a prep school, but she goes with him. When he goes to Harvard University for his 4-year degree, mother goes with him. Sarah cannot leave her son Franklin alone. She has strong apron strings, and she does not let this boy have a normal childhood. All right. After Harvard, he goes to law school and becomes a lawyer. Around 1905, he goes to a family reunion that involves the New York City Roosevelts and the Roosevelts from Hyde Park. The Hyde Park Roosevelts lived along the Hudson River north of New York City. And the New York City Roosevelts were made up of Teddy Roosevelt and his group here. Okay? Teddy had a brother who in turn had a very troublesome marriage. His wife had died, and they left behind several children, including a little girl named Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt is the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. And here at this party, this family reunion in 1905, Franklin meets Eleanor, and they fall madly in love. They are like fifth cousins. Okay? Eleanor was raised by her grandmother, who told this little girl that she was so ugly that she would never marry. You don't tell a little kid this. That's crazy. When Eleanor turned 12 years old, she was sent to a boarding school in London for her education. Okay? And here Eleanor will have mixed opinions about her sexuality. She's not sure if she's straight or gay or bisexual. The lady has a lot of issues when it comes to her personal preferences. But she does fall in love with Franklin, and they do get married. Now, this is a royal marriage of the time period. TR gave her away at the wedding, and people looked upon them as like being an American royal family here in this time period. They did have 5 children, but Sarah, the mother, stayed in the middle of them. She built a house for Franklin and Eleanor in Hyde Park and had a house right next door to them. They had no privacy against mother or from mother. Okay? There's a famous photograph that was shot around 1915. It showed Franklin and the boys on one side of the picture. On the other side of the picture is Eleanor and the daughters, and in the middle sits mother. I know how Eleanor stood it. And a lot of people said that her and Sarah did not get along with each other. They did have a lot of tensions in the marriage. And Sarah's always putting in her opinion and never letting Franklin have his own to say in what happened here in his own marriage. Okay? During World War I, Franklin will be the Undersecretary of the Navy. In 1920, he runs for the vice presidency with James Cox, and they lose the election. Well, in 1921, the Roosevelts decided to go up into the areas of Maine for vacation. And up here in August of 1921, Franklin Roosevelt is going to contact a disease from a child. This is a childhood disease that a man who's 39 years old should not have. And the disease is called polio. He had gone swimming, he got chilled, he came in. Eleanor put him to bed, fed him some hot soup, and during the night, the muscles from his back down through his heels of his feet are going to be paralyzed. The man can never walk again unassisted. He has to have somebody with him to help hold him up. They do develop some leg irons to help him out, but they're so heavy that he has a hard time maneuvering in this devices here, in these braces they made for him. And these braces weigh 10 pounds apiece. So he's got 20 pounds of braces under his body trying to hold him up. Well, he's going to discover that down in Georgia is a warm springs that will help him with his problem of paralysis. And he's going to start going to Warm Springs, Georgia for treatment. And that does help. All right. In 1928, he's going to run for the governorship of New York, and they disguise his medical situation. Now today, they'd have blown it wide open. There'd been no privacy, there'd been no secrecy about this. They would exploit him today. Now, during his illness, Eleanor finds some love letters. These love letters have come from a young lady who's originally from Savannah, Georgia. She grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. She is a personal secretary of Eleanor. And this young girl is beautiful. And Eleanor finds out in the love letters that her husband's having extramarital affairs with this young lady. Okay? This young lady from Baltimore, Maryland, is then having an affair here with the president. Her name is Lucy Mercer. Lucy Mercer is beautiful, and Eleanor decides that he loves her because she is ugly. And Eleanor does not divorce Franklin, she cuts him off. They will be together as partners, but not in any kind of intimate manner. She's totally cut him off sexually from their marriage. Okay? And she tells Franklin, do not see Lucy Mercer ever again. Well, with her being out of Savannah, Georgia, and him going to Warm Springs, Georgia from time to time, they do see each other. Their relationship will continue until the day that he dies. When Franklin Roosevelt dies on the 12th of April, 1945 at Warm Springs, Georgia, Lucy Mercer's in the house. Eleanor is in Washington, D.C. So this relationship between the president and his mistress continues on. Here again today, this will all be exposed. There'd been no way that he could have been the president during this time period if the news media had exposed his extramarital relationship. In 1925, trying to help her husband in his political career, which looked pretty limited by his paralysis, Eleanor is going to join the New York City Democratic Women's Club. And she gets heavily involved in Democratic Party functions here. And while in this organization, she's going to be introduced to several lesbian women, and one of them she falls in love with. Her name is Leora Hickok, and she is going to be with her all during the presidency. So in the White House will be the First Lady and her mistress. But Eleanor also has relations with various young men, including members of the Secret Service that are there to protect her. So Eleanor is trying to find love and compassion in a world that she does not feel as if she really fits into. And Eleanor is going to be a major player in the years of the Great Depression, trying to find her position in society. And she will find it. She'll be one of the lucky ones that she will get through this, and she will come out on the other side in better shape than she was in the 1920s. Okay? So guys, Governor Roosevelt in 1928 becomes the governor of New York. Shortly after his inauguration, New York State goes into the Great Depression, just like the rest of the country does. And Franklin Roosevelt sees the failures of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is kind of paralyzed by the Depression. The man does not make very good decisions during this time period. He'd make a great man for the presidency in a time of crisis. He's been through crises, but this Great Depression totally stuns him. He does not know which way to turn. He tried putting out stimulus money to help corporations. He told the corporations, y'all will use this money to bring your employees back into the job markets and to help stabilize your actual businesses. It would help out. They sent over $500 million out to different corporations to stabilize them, and the owners of the corporation put the money in their pockets. They did not use the money to hire or rehire workers who have been laid off from their jobs. So that didn't work whatsoever at all. And everything Mr. Hoover tried, he tried a new housing market approach, trying to get out new federal loans to help in the housing crisis. That did not work. It's really crazy. In 1932, in the midterm elections, or actually 1931's midterm elections, he tries to bring in more stimulus for the American people, and that does not work. And the American people are so fed up with Herbert Hoover in 1931 that they fill the House and the Senate with Democrats. And these Democrats refuse to work with the president. They're waiting for their man to come along and let their man get all the power and all the glory from getting the country out of the Depression. So guys, Democrats take the oath of office here in 1931 with no plans to end the Depression until 1933 when their man might show up for the presidency. This is crazy politics. And that's what you see in America today. You see one party trying to stifle the other party and nothing gets done. And who suffers? The American people suffer, is what takes place. Okay? And that's true today in this pandemic we're in, is you see that The Republicans, the Democrats won't agree on stimulus packages. They won't agree on how to handle this problem, this problem with COVID, and with American people are the ones who are suffering from it. And it's really a sad case here that this takes place. Well, in Albany, New York, Governor Roosevelt decides to start a New Deal program. He says, I'm going to try to test out what can be done to end the Depression. So in 1932, I will run for the presidency, and I'll have a program ready to go that's been tested in New York State. You know, this president went to Columbia University, and he brought in professors of economics. He brought in professors of history, of sociology. He brought in professors of religion and so forth. And he created what he called his brain trust. His brain trust were all these college professors that could help him try to figure out what to do to stop this depression. So when he runs for the presidency in 1932, he's got a test bed already established of what could be done to help in this Great Depression. Okay, now what caused the Great Depression? Well, the first thing is going to be the unequal distribution of wealth between the wealthy class and the poor class. Henry Ford made $14 million a year as a head of the Ford Motor Company. His average employee made $750 a year. He makes $14 million. The average employee makes $750. Total distribution, unequal distribution between rich and poor is during this time period. You had new machineries that was created in the 1920s. They increased the industrial output by 32%. When we built that war machine during World War I, we built a war machine that could supply us way more than what we needed. And so they're producing 32% more products than the American people can handle. And all those excess products are going to the European marketplace. We're flooding the marketplace of Europe with cheap goods. In other words, we look like China does today in the 1920s. We're sending all of our extra consumer goods to Europe at a cheaper price, and they cannot compete on our home markets. Okay? Then in 1926, President Coolidge gave the wealthy 10% a major tax break. A major income tax break. It's called the Revenue Act of 1926. And now the wealthier class pays a lower amount of income tax than anybody else in America. And that leads to the Great Depression. Okay? 3/4 of all Americans in 1927 spent all of their yearly income on houses, cars, and consumer goods. They had no savings. The American people were in debt and had no savings here in this time period. All right, the concept of buying now and paying later is going to cause the economy to falter. Okay, people cannot buy new products because of this policy. In other words, they cannot buy new cars here or new radios here because they're already in debt and they cannot upsize or upgrade to a new automobile in this time period. Okay? The Europeans are struggling after World War I. We have sent over $25 billion to the European countries, including Germany, and they're no better off than they were when World War I has ended. Okay? And then the American people are misusing the stock market. There's lots of insider trading going on, and people are buying stock on the margins. If you own 10,000 shares of stock, you can use that 10,000 shares of stock to borrow money to buy more stock. Let's say you go to 15,000 shares of stock. You can use that stock to buy more stock with. And it keeps multiplying and multiplying because you're buying stock on the margins. And that all fell through. Okay? So in October of 1929, it all falls apart. Wall Street goes under. The American banking system begins to falter. And the American people run to their banks to withdraw all of their money, which causes a major banking crisis. People will lose their money in the banks here. Okay? People can afford to buy the new goods being produced by industries, and so therefore industries begin to close down. They lay off workers. More workers get laid off, fewer consumer goods are being purchased, and more people get laid off. It totally snowballs here in this time period. People by 1930 are declaring bankruptcy. A lot of folks are committing suicide because they have lost everything they have owned. Okay? Trade with European countries begin to totally fall apart. Europeans trying to buy American goods, that falls apart. And all of a sudden you have over 25% you have 25% unemployment, and you enter into a worldwide depression. This depression is going to affect Russia, Germany, all the European countries, Japan, China. The whole world goes into a Great Depression from all this activity here. So guys, by not settling World War I and all the craziness of the world of the Roaring Twenties in America, and the Europeans not be able to to regain their economic strength here in the 1920s, we go into this Great Depression. And it's going to be a major, major problem here for the American people. Okay? In January of 1930, Mr. Hoover is going to send over $600 million to help in construction projects to get people jobs. And of course, the people who gets the money are the ones who puts in their pocket. In 1932, he starts what is called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is a help corporations borrow money trying to get themselves reestablished. You know that the RFC was used a lot by your airline companies in this time period. And that's going to help them out to a certain extent. In 1924, we had a federal aviation project started in which America, the United States, is going to start building airports across the country. This is 1924 time, or 1922 time period. The United States Army is going to be in charge of the airmail system, flying in and out of these new airports being built during this time period. Okay? This is called the Army Model Airway System, and it's mostly for the mail. And we run a Pony Express here by using airplanes. And of course, these new runways will be about 2,500 feet long. They will have blue lights and white lights along the taxiways and the runways. On the water towers or on the control towers, these airports will be lights that will be turning to let people know if it's a commercial airport or a military airport. Commercial airports had one light that went around in the beacon. Military airports had two lights on the beacons that went around the water towers here. And so we start this system of Pony Express here, trying to see if the airline business could be created with the mail system. In 1925, Congress is going to pass what is called the Kelly Act. That's spelled K-E-L-L-E-Y. The Kelly Act is going to issue in the airline business. And the Kelly Act is going to be controlled by the post office. Instead of the military supplying airplanes and pilots, now you're going to have fixed-base operators who will supply the airplanes and the pilots. And these fixed-base operators have got to go through and get permission from the postal system in order to carry the airmail. And these new airlines that are developed during this time period include Northwest Air Transport out of Minneapolis-St. Paul, Minnesota, Western Airlines out of Los Angeles, California. You'll have United Airlines being formed out of Chicago, Illinois. You'll have American Airlines being formed out of Dallas-Fort Worth. You'll have Transcontinental Airlines being formed out of out of Kansas City, Missouri. So all these little airline companies began to get themselves in operation by carrying the airmail. The airmail is where they got their profits from. Passenger service just added to the profits here. Their planes were mainly the three-motored airplane that Boeing built, and that Fokker built, and that Ford Motor Company built. These are all called trimotors. They had an engine in the nose of the plane, and they had an engine hanging on each wing. So you had three engines on board the airplanes here. You want to see a trimotor airplane, the Pensacola Air Museum has one on display in their museum. These planes were made to carry about 12 people, and these planes were hard to fly on. They were rickety. They had lots of vibration. The exhaust from the central engine went into the fuselage, into the cabin of the plane. People got sick from sitting in the airplane. They got carbon monoxide poisoning. They also had trouble hearing after they took a flight. They said if you flew for 3 hours, you were deaf for 3 days. The planes were so noisy in this time period. And so these airplanes, airline companies began to be formed here from the Cali Act through the postal system in 1925. Okay, so this all is going to be transpiring in this time period. The airline business will suffer some losses going into the Great Depression, but they're going to be seen as being a very stable industry during the Great Depression. President Roosevelt always said the airline companies could get America out of the Great Depression. He believed in the power of aviation here in this period of time. Okay. Mr. Hoover also, as I mentioned a while ago, is going to form the Federal Home Loan Act. This is in June of 1932. The Federal Home Banking Act is going to try to bail out the housing market. And of course, what happens is that most of the banks are going to pocket this money that is going to be trying to be used to help the American consumer here in this time period. So we got lots of issues going on here, guys, in the early 1930s. Then in 1932, Mr. Hoover blows it. In 1932, the American Army, the American soldiers of World War I, has met the 15-year mark toward their pension. The soldiers of World War I will have a chance to get a full pension in 1945. This is halfway. And these soldiers are going to come to Washington, D.C. to ask for an early payment of their pension. They say it's been 15 years. If we can get half our pension and leave the other half where it is, we can make it. And you had thousands of American soldiers, veterans of World War I, who come to Washington, D.C. to ask for their pension. Congress approves it. President Hoover vetoes it. And these men begin to protest. The power of the American protest. And this president decided to call in the United States Army to put down these protests. The leader of the Army in this time period is going to be General Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur is going to come with the American Army. He's going to displace these soldiers, run them out of town. They have built a cardboard village up in Maryland. He goes in there and burns the whole place down. He overextends his authority here in this time period. And we call this the bonus army. The bonus army came in with peaceful protests, trying to get part of their pension. Mr. MacArthur is going to tell the American people that these men have communist ties, that these men are trying to destroy democracy. These are our soldiers. Why do we treat our veterans in such disgraceful graceful ways? And we've done this over and over and over again. Charles Forbes, and the Veterans Bureau, and what he did here, guys, stealing money from the hospitals that were being built for the veterans here. And now MacArthur accuses these guys of being communist and their policies. Now, this all took place in July of 1932. The election's in November. And when Roosevelt hears of what they happened to the bonus army, he tells the American people, this elects me. Mr. Hoover has blown his chance for re-election because of how he treated the bonus army. And here in November of 1932, the American people overwhelmingly voted for Mr. Roosevelt. He told the American people, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And he says, I'm coming in here with a new deal for the American people, and we're going to save America. We're going to bring America back to the way it used to be. And I have ways to end this depression. Y'all just hold on, and you'll see what I'll do for you in this time period. Okay, March the 4th, he takes the oath of office. Well, guys, in January of 1933, just a few months before Roosevelt takes office here, Adolf Hitler becomes the co-chancellor of Germany. And here in March, the chancellor, the old man who Hitler's supposed to be working with, is going to die. And Hitler takes full power in Germany by April of 1933, just about a month after Roosevelt takes the oath of office on March the 4th, 1933. And both men will die in 1945. They'll die within 2 weeks of each other. Mr. Roosevelt dies first, Hitler dies second. So it's interesting how these two men are going to bookend each other in America. Adolf Hitler tells the German people that he's going to build a Reich that's going to last for over 1,000 years. It only lasts about 12. Roosevelt is a president who is going to be elected 4 times to the presidency. He could have served for 16 years if he had not died during the 4th month of his presidency in 1945. So you see what's going on here with these two men. They bookend each other during this time period. Mr. Roosevelt is going to call for the banks to be closed in March of 1933. You know, the biggest problem, y'all remember this, the biggest problem he faces is unemployment. To get the people employed, they've got to have a better banking system. So therefore, to help the unemployed, you've got to rebuild the banking system. And what he does here on March the 5th, the day after he takes inauguration, he brings the American bankers into Washington, D.C. He locks them up into a hotel, and he tells them that you have got to make new regulations for the banks. You got to go through and make the banks solvent again. To get the banks to the point that the American people will trust the banks when they're employed, they'll put the money in the banks and not under their mattresses, where it does no good for the American economy. And so you have what is called the bank holiday. The bank holiday is trying to restabilize the banks so when unemployment begins to decrease, the American people will use their banks again. And here, for several days, the banks are closed, and these men are not allowed to leave this hotel. They're forced to stay in here. And they make the new rules for banking, okay? And part of this new rules for banking is going to include the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. And that's going to protect your bank accounts. It says that if your bank should close, that your money is insured by the FDIC, that you cannot lose your money. And this was put into play on the 16th day of June of 1933. So again, the bank stabilization is an important part of this. Another part of this was the Federal Securities Act. They're going to start regulating Wall Street. Wall Street goes under federal regulations to make sure that Wall Street has standards that must be met. So the financial part is getting your bank stabilized, ensuring the people's money, and making sure that Wall Street investments are secure. That's your 3 major areas here of this time period. Okay? Then they're going to pass what is called the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This is for state aid. They're going to put federal dollars into states to help them stabilize and help them start rebuilding the states. You know, Mr. Obama did this in 2009. In 2009, he appropriated special federal funding in the states to help the states recover. Oklahoma County got a big amount of money from this program here. And with this money, we built the overpass and all the interchanges in front of the airline terminal here on Highway 85 between Valparaiso and Shalimar. We also are going to start 4-laning Highway 123. A lot of folks died between the air terminal and Highway 85 going to Crestview on that old 2-lane road. Now it's been 4-lane. We built the overpass above Niceville that connects to 123 to Highway 90 to Highway 85. And then we went up to Duke Field and built the bypasses up here and the bridges up here at Duke Field. This was all done from the stimulus money that Mr. Obama put out for the states to use for building projects. And so we did quite well with these new roads that are being done here. It's a pity we didn't get a bypass around Crestview out of this. And they did try to do that, and that didn't work out for us. We did get the bridges around the airline terminal and the bridges on Highway 85 going up to Crestview during this time period. Okay, so May the 12th, you'll have the Federal Emergency Relief Administration that's going to have aid for the states here in this time period. Then in June, he's going to create what is called the Public Works Administration. They realize that this depression could lead the United States into an insurrection. And it could start with our workers over the age of 25. That these men between the ages of 25 and 50 could have insurrection across the country and bring in communism. To bring in communism. And so therefore, this president is going to have a program to hire these people in this age group. And this is part of the Public Works Administration, the PWA. And he hired over 8 million American workers out of 25 million unemployed. He hired 8 million people to work in the PWA. And they're going to start building federal buildings. They're going to build federal highways. They'll work on the railroad system. They're going to start building bridges across the rivers in America, get rid of the ferry boats. You'll now have bridges across the river. When I was a kid, when I first moved to Okaloosa County in 1957, all the bridges here in Okaloosa County had been built by the WPA. Edge Elementary School in Niceville was built by the WPA, or the PWA. And all these bridges, the Marga Bridge going across to Destin, and all the bridges through Walnut Beach were all 2-lane bridges that had pilings made out of cypress. And these bridges were pretty rickety. And these bridges were not replaced until the 1960s. Okay, and now we have a pretty good road structure, and we keep these bridges in well repair. Brooks Bridge needs to be replaced, and it was built during the night. It was built back in 1964. So you're starting to see all these bridges being built here. And Highway 90 had a lot of bridges that were built during this time period by the PWA and later by the WPA. And these were men working here trying to get jobs, federal jobs, to build bridges. They built airports. They built federal courthouses. They built hospitals. They worked on the infrastructure here in this time period. The president tells the American people, I'm going to bring you the 3 R's. Now, y'all need to know what the 3 R's are. The 3 R's are, I'm going to bring you relief. I'm going to bring you recovery. I'm going to bring you reform. Relief, recovery, and reform are the 3 R's that Roosevelt is going to promise the American people. Well, you know, he also realized that the young men between the ages of 18 and 24 needed jobs, that they too could bring in insurrection because they're the next generation of American workers. And they formed what is called the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. The Civilian Conservation Corps is going to allow us to put young men between the ages of 18 and 24 to work, okay? These men will come out of rural communities, and they'll come out of urban areas of cities. And over 500,000 young men will be employed by the CCC in the start of it. By the end, it'll be over 1 million young men. Now, the United States Army is going to run the CCC. And a lot of folks didn't like it. He said the CCC was too materialistic, that the military had much control over the CCC. And it looked like America was trying to build an army out of these boys. Well, that's kind of true to this extent. I want you guys to realize that Adolf Hitler and also Joseph Stalin of Russia are going to do the same thing. They brought in public works to build the autobahns in Germany to improve the cities and infrastructures of Germany. Stalin did it in his Soviet Union during this time period. We had the CCC camps. Germany had the Hitler Youth camps. You have the Soviet youth camps in Russia during that time period. So these leaders around the world are trying the same programs at the same time, trying to find a way to end this depression as quickly as possible. Now, with the CCC, these young men are going to be paid $30 a month. They're paid $30 a month. And here's the idea behind the CCC. They're going to build a camp in which these boys live. There'll be barracks, and there'll also be a mess hall, just like a military base. Have any of you guys been to Jackson Guard in Niceville, Florida? It started its life as a CC camp here in the 1930s. They worked across the Florida National Forest. They worked out in the bays. They worked in various projects here along the beaches here of Northwest Florida, putting in pavilions and picnic tables and all this stuff. And Niceville had several hundred boys that were in the CC camp here at Niceville during this war. During World War II, the CC camp here in Niceville becomes a POW camp for German prisoners who come in after D-Day. As we captured German prisoners, we brought them to America for POW camps. And these young men worked, a lot of them worked here out of the Niceville region because there are POWs here in Niceville. A lot of folks don't realize this, okay? So guys, the CCC camps are pretty important. The boys are paid $30 a month. The rule is the boys get to keep $15 for themselves, and they can send the other money home to mom and dad. Now, with the CCC camp housing you and feeding you and clothing you, you don't need much money. Most of these boys just want a little bit of spending money to buy a hamburger once in a while, maybe go buy a Coke or something, maybe go on a date, that sort of thing. And that didn't cost much money to do all that. So a lot of you boys spend as much as $25 or $20 a month they sent home. And this did save American families. My father told me about his first cousin. His aunt and uncle, this is my grandpa Wetford's sister, my great aunt, they didn't have anything. They lost their farm in the beginning of the Great Depression, and they were totally destitute. They were depending upon other family members to buy them with food. My dad told me how they were always trying to send stuff over to Rufus's house, trying to feed the family. It's a big situation here for these folks. Okay? So guys, what happens here is that Rufus, who turns 18 years old, gets a job with the CCC. He joins the Mississippi group of the CCC. He goes down there between Pelahatchie and Newton and helps to build a new lake. It's called Lake Roosevelt. It's there off Interstate 20 between Meridian and Jackson. Y'all can go find it on Google Earth pretty quickly. And he helped them create that lake down there. And he started sending money home to his mom and dad. The next year, his brother joined the CCC. And now the family had $30 a month coming in from the two boys working. By 1938, they were able to buy a new farm. They got out of the Great Depression. So a lot of families benefited from the CCC camps of this time period, okay? So it's very important y'all realize how the CCC camps will help the American people, how the PWA is going to help the American people. This is the first time you start seeing federal dollars going to public works. Mr. Roosevelt takes the old populist ideology of providing public works during depressions. In the 1800s, they would not do it. Herbert Hoover would not do it, but this president did it. He says, I've got to build the economy from within. I got to bring relief reform to the American people to help recovery. And then, of course, you have Mr. Henry Wallace. My dad told me that Henry Wallace was the hero of the Southern farmer, that people looked up to Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was put into play to oversee the agricultural problems of America. Henry Wallace will head up what is called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. Jimmy Carter wrote about him in his biography that is called An Hour for Daylight. We discussed the Great Depression in Georgia while he was a boy. And it's interesting, when I read Jimmy Carter's stories from being in the Great Depression as a teenager, and I heard Dad's stories from a teenager, I realized how much they were alike in their stories. And I had Dad read Jimmy Carter's book. Dad went on to Plains, Georgia, to Jimmy Carter's Sunday school class. He's got a picture of him standing with him and Mom are standing with Rosalind and Jimmy Carter there in front of the church there in Plains, Georgia. So I thought this is interesting how my dad read this book and identified with this president and wanted to go actually see the man. All right. So guys, Henry Wallace is going to put together a program that's going to save the farmers. And here is what Henry Wallace decides to do. He says the American farmer is producing too many goods. We have got to cut back on the number of items that they are making. He's going to send several agents to every county. This is 14,000 counties. So you've got close to like 100,000 men who are hired by the federal government to go to 14,000 counties as agricultural agents. And they're going to use airplanes and photograph the farms. The farms will be put onto a photograph. And then they're going to have draftsmen that's going to put the acreage of these farms onto blueprints. And on these blueprints, they're going to section off the land for various kinds of production. Now, here in the South, the big thing was cotton. They told the farmers had to go through a limited amount of cotton they grew. So each farmer had a little square plot on this map of just cotton and those certain acres. And then they'd have a certain acres for corn, and then for tobacco, and for sugar cane, and so forth. They made the farmers diversify into a number of crops where they did not grow a massive amount. They had to grow a quota. If you go over the quota, you had to plow those crops up. And by doing so, by 1936, the American farmers began to show a profit. They began to show a profit. You know, when I was a little boy in 1955, I was 4 years old in 1955. My father was a school principal in Emmett County, Mississippi. That's where Liberty is located. That's where Mom's from. And Dad only taught 9 months out of the year. To make up an income for the summertime, Dad got a job with agricultural agents in Emmett County, Mississippi. And Dad would go out in the mornings to see these farmers, to survey their land, to make sure they had not overproduced what their quota was in their farming. And I would go with Dad out to these farms across Emmett County as he talked to these farmers. I see my dad spread that big, huge map across the hood of our 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air, and he put his foot on that multi-structured bumper with a farmer standing next to him, and Dad had a pencil from on his ear he pulled out, and they looked at that map. And Dad said, I think you might have a little bit too much sweet potatoes. Why don't you go plow a row up just for safety? Well, those little old ladies saw me, that little cute blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy out there in front of that car, and they'd come and get me. And I want to tell you, I was in high society. Those little old ladies give me tea cakes, and I had strawberries and cream. I had strawberry ice creams and peaches. They took care of me in their kitchens. They loved on me. They loved to see me come see them. They called me Mr. Dave. Mr. Dave, what are you doing out here with your daddy? And I remember that so vividly. And those little old ladies taking good care of me and loving on me. And Daddy out there helping those farmers to make sure they had a good income that year. And those farmers respected it because Dad was honest with them. It made a difference. So a lot of this history I'm telling you about, I've lived through it. I have seen it happen. And it's so interesting to be able to tell you guys these stories, because otherwise you wouldn't know about all this stuff and how important it was to the farmers here in this time period. Henry Wallace was a hero. Dad and my grandpa swore the best president in American history was Franklin Roosevelt. They were Roosevelt Democrats, and they never changed. Dad was a diehard Democrat until the day he died. He loved the Democratic Party because he said they saved us in the Great Depression. Grandpa Weatherford didn't like Republicans. He said all they do is lie to us. I got stickled to him. He says a lot of Republican. And he would not have anything to do with the Republican Party. He was all Democrat because of Henry Wallace and Franklin Roosevelt and what they did here to help the farmers out. You know, in 1936, my grandpa got his farm back. He lost his farm in 1932. They had a sharecrop. Dead, and they were sharecroppers. And he got in with the new authority here, the AAA. He was able to get a home, they were get a farm loan, and they moved. I want you to tell you something. When Dad told me the story about them moving 8 miles to a new farm in the 1930s, it was amazing. Dad said the first thing they did was built a corn crib on the new property. And they moved all the corn by wagon from Muchalutchee up to Basadia. That's 8 miles. And it took like 8 trips to get the corn all in the corn crib from the old corn crib. And each trip was a day's round trip. That's 8 days they spent just hauling corn. Then they started carrying the furniture up. And then they started bringing out the clothing and all that stuff. They spent like 4 weeks moving, guys. And the last thing we moved were the cattle. And Dad said my Uncle Murray and my Uncle Louis were put in charge of the cows. Uncle Murray was born in 1924. Uncle Louis was born in 1928. And these two were competitors from the word go. And they put these two boys, a teenage boy and a boy about 10 years old, in charge of moving those cows up Highway 19 from Muckaleshey up to Basadia. And Murray said they get on that Highway 19 with all those cows and all those calves, and they're trying to keep them all together in one big wad, trying to herd them at the same time. They had to walk behind the cows to do this stuff. Highway 19 was a dirt road during this time period. And people would come in their T-Model 4s and blow their horns and scare the cows into the woods. They did it on purpose, just to be mean to those boys. And said they spent half their time that day getting all the cows out of the woods. They finally got to Basadia. There's a little schoolhouse up there and had a basketball court out on the outside, a bunch of boys playing basketball. And next to the school was a corral, and they put all the cows in the corral and started playing basketball. Well, dark comes up on them, and Grandpa don't know where they are. He's worried about his 2 boys and all of his cows. And he starts walking down the road trying to find them. And he comes to the schoolhouse and finds Murray and Louie playing basketball, and those 2 boys got a whooping right then and there. And then the cows came onto the house. So these stories are interesting when you hear about these folks and how they had to live here in this time period and having to go from place to place because of the Great Depression, trying to make a living. And Grandpa got up here in Basadia. He had over 280 acres of land on his new farm, and he diversified. He started growing trees. He had a tree farm. He grew some cotton. He grew a little bit of corn, and he had a dairy farm. He diversified. And my grandpa said that Henry Wallace was his hero. And Henry Wallace will become your vice president with Mr. Roosevelt in 1941. It's a pity he was not vice president when Roosevelt died, because Henry Wallace had a plan for America, and our world would be totally different today if Henry Wallace had been president instead of Harry Truman. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture, because we talk about World War II and what's going on there. Another major agricultural problem, of course, was the Dust Bowl. Out in Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, they had used the disc plows on these tractors so much during World War I and during the 1920s, the land began to suffer. There are no buffalo out here to protect the land as there had once been. In 1930, 1931, 1932, we had great droughts that took place across the Great Plains, and the topsoil began to blow away. We have what is called the Dust Bowl. Y'all know that Dust Bowl was so bad that the ships out in the Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles off the coast of North Carolina, in the morning had mud on their decks. The mud was caused from the dirt from the Oklahoma and Kansas being blown across the country, getting mixed in with the dew, and it actually was muddy the next morning on your ships. Dad told me up in the Shelby County, Mississippi, that the sky stayed orange all day long. That some days you can't even see the sun because there's so much dust in the air. The dust bowls were horrendous. And President Roosevelt is going to start a program trying to solve the Dust Bowl problems. And what they did is they went in here and brought in over 8 million heads of cows into this region and started feeding the cows hay. Hay is full of seeds, grass seeds. The cow's stomach does not digest the grass seeds, so it's pooped out. And so you have manure around the grass seeds, and the cows begin to urinate on the Great Plains. They brought in deep wells to irrigate. By 1945, the Dust Bowl has been ended. If we had never killed the buffalo, we had never had this environmental disaster. It was caused because we killed off the buffaloes in the 1870s and 1880s. All right? Y'all know in 1924, Congress proposed that the Tennessee River be filled with dams to bring electric power to the southeast. Calvin Coolidge vetoed it. He wouldn't hear of it. In 1933, 1934, here comes the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority is going to build dams across the Tennessee River. Muscle Shoals, Decatur, Chattanooga, on the Cumberland River, up around Nashville, Tennessee. We're going to start putting in hydroelectric dams up here. And all of a sudden, little towns like Tupelo, Mississippi, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Birmingham, Huntsville, Decatur, Jackson, Tennessee, you're going to start seeing electrical power here in these areas. Do y'all know that Tupelo, Mississippi came out of the Depression early because they brought industry in that hired the people in Tupelo because they had the power, the electrical power into Tupelo? I just bought some brand new living room furniture. It's made by Lane Furniture that is based in Tupelo, Mississippi. And so Tupelo becomes a major industrial place for making furniture, and particularly during this time period. Tupelo is also known for making Cooper tires. So this area begins to boom because they put in these hydroelectric dams. A side note on this, up in Tennessee, where all this power was available, we built a secret city. The city is called Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And this city is where nuclear fission for the atomic bomb is going to be heavily influenced. Without Oak Ridge, Tennessee, we probably never had a nuclear weapon. They used this area up here in these new hydroelectric dams to develop the atomic weapons of the mid-1940s. Okay? On June the 19th, 1934, they created what is called the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Now, this commission is going to regulate the media. They want to make sure that no person or no group has the authority to take over American broadcasting. Okay, y'all hear me? They do not want monopoly news companies to take over the airways. And they tell the people here, if you own a radio or a newspaper, you cannot have the newspaper and the radio station in the same town. If you own a newspaper in Tupelo, Mississippi, you cannot own one in Jackson or Memphis or Nashville. You got to go way across the country, maybe to Arizona, to own another newspaper. They don't want to see a conglomeration of news media people. They heavily regulated the radio and the television later on and the newspaper business. The FCC wants to make sure the American people are getting straight news that is unbiased, particularly from political entities. Well, guys, in 1981, President Ronald Reagan began to do away with all of these New Deal programs, all these regulations. It's called deregulation is what it's called. Richard Nixon started it. Mr. Reagan got heavily involved in it. And all of a sudden, you got CNN, and you got Fox News, and MSNBC, and all these conglomerates of news that controls the news media. And now they're political. Fox is heavily Republican. CNN is heavily Democrat. That is one thing the FCC did not want. They wanted to make sure that monopoly news organizations were not created across America. They could bring in fake news. And I'm really seriously thinking that maybe it is time to bring back the FCC and start regulating these news people and this media outlets, because it's getting to the point we have no daily newspapers left in America, and what we do have is so pitiful. I mean, I quit subscribing to the Daily News a long time ago. I've had the Valpy Library quit subscribing to the Daily News. There's no news in it. You get more news off of Facebook and off of Yahoo and CNN or Fox on the internet than you can get from the Daily News. And so it's a mess out here. The news media has got to be put under control again, because they've had too much freedom. And after seeing this election of 2020, I'm about to come to the conclusion it's time for us to do something about the news media and to start trying to find a way to make this an organization that is reliable again, that is actually more concerned with giving us good news, or giving us better news sources, I should say. We all want some good news. That's all it boils down to. And then in August of 1934, August the 14th, 1934, the president is going to bring in a new organization to help the old folks. He's brought money in for the middle-class men. He's brought programs in for the younger men. And now he says we got to have programs for the older Americans to make sure they're secure in their lives. And they bring in what is called Social Security. This is pensions for older Americans. If you're 62 years of, well, actually 65 during this time period. If you're 65 years of age, you can get $40 a month from the federal government. That is your old age pensions. My dad told me the only reason that his family made it through the Great Depression is because Grandpa William, who was born in 1862, that Grandpa William got Social Security. And he lived with Grandma and Grandpa. And he said that Grandpa would give Grandma and Grandpa a little bit of money to help them out if they needed it. And Dad told me that in 1936, he finished high school in 1936. He got a scholarship over at East Central Mississippi Junior College in Newton to play basketball. And he'd come home some weekends, he had a chance to get off. There's no ball games. He'd come home, he'd ride the bus over. And he said before he left on a Sunday to head back to school, that Grandpa Will would walk him to the mailbox. Grandpa Will says, "Poe, I can't go any further, but son, I love you, and I want you to make sure that you have a little bit of spending money." Said every time Grandpa walked him to the mailbox and handed him a dollar bill. And Dad said that dollar bill could buy him 5 hamburgers. It could buy him 4 blue plate specials. If he wanted dessert with it, it'd cost him 3 blue plate specials. But he said that money meant a lot to him. And I sat here many a day in the same room, my kitchen here, and listened to Dad tell me about his grandpa. Dad sat right here in front of me is where he would sit. So I'm kind of channeling in right now some of Dad's stuff about growing up during the Great Depression and how bad it was for these kids here in this time period. But Social Security made a difference in the Weatherford household in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Weatherford, the Bethsaida, Mississippi, Grandpa Weatherford, great Grandpa Will, made a difference. You know that he died when I was 4 years old. I remember Grandpa Will. I remember a gentleman who was born in 1862. That's hard to imagine. Okay, I'm old, but I'm not that old yet. Okay, in 1935, President Roosevelt said there are more people who need more help, and here comes your second 100 days. Here comes your second 100 days here in 1935. And this time he says, I've got to go through and get more construction jobs for the American workers. And he starts what is called the PWA. I'm sorry, the WPA. The PWA came in 1933. WPA comes in 1935. This is the Works Project Administration. The Works Project Administration. Okay? This time we're going to start building new canals. One of these canals is here locally. They decide to hook up the Tombigbee River with the Tennessee River up here at Muscle Shoals. The Tombigbee River goes up to Demopolis, Alabama, and then it branches off in Mississippi. And you have the Black Warrior River that goes up toward Tuscaloosa. And they went up the Tombigbee River and started digging a canal that goes along the state line between Mississippi and Alabama up to Muscle Shoals. Whenever I go to Ole Miss, I go across the Tombigbee Waterway, as they call it, the Tennessee Tom Waterway, between Hamilton and Tupelo. It's a pretty good sized canal up through here. And it carries a lot of barges and a lot of freight out of Mobile up to the Tennessee River. And that was built during this time period. They built the Bankhead Tunnel in Mobile during this time period. This is on Government Street in Mobile. That tunnel is built underground. The George Wallace tunnels of Interstate 10 were sunk and attached to the bottom of the river. They're like two straws going under the river. They actually dug out under the river to build the Bankhead Tunnel. That's why it goes down so deep into the ground before you come back up again. All right? So we're going to build that here in this time period. We're going to start building airports. When I wrote an article for the University of Mississippi, for the Mississippi Encyclopedia, I decided to write about aviation. So I've written a little manuscript about the history of Southern Airways, and Southern flew out of Memphis all over Mississippi, down to Mobile and New Orleans. There were 14 little towns in Mississippi that Southern Airways flew DC-3s into in the 1950s and 1960s. They brought DC-9 jets into these little towns, Mississippi. A lot of these little towns don't even have airports now, or don't even have air service now. But Southern had DC-9s flying these cities across Mississippi. So I decided to write about aviation, Mississippi. And two of my heroes here, besides Roscoe Turner and the Flying Circus, is going to be the Key brothers. Al and Fred Key lived in Meridian, Mississippi. And they had a little grass runway that paralleled Highway 11 south of Meridian. And they decided they wanted a brand new airport in Meridian. Delta Airlines was wanting to fly into Meridian, but there was no suitable runway. They didn't want to fly on a grass field. And so the Key boys decided to stage an aviation stunt to get federal funding to build their airport. What they did was they bought two identical airplanes. One airplane would be used for refueling. They put a special hose, they put a special water, they put a special fuel tank in there. The other airplane, they put a ledge on the plane, like a little bumper, and it went from the cockpit door down to the engine. And here they could grab a hold of that hose from the airplane above them, refuel the plane they called the Ole Miss. They had lowered down baskets full of motor oil so they could re-oil the engine. And they brought in the baskets where the two boys' wives would cook them meals. And for 27 days, the Key brothers did not land. They flew continuously over the city of Meridian. 27 days. And when they decided to land, over 20,000 people lined the runway, that old grass runway, down there below downtown Meridian, and the two boys landed. It will not be until 1968 and the Apollo moon mission where we break the time that these two boys were in the air. Pretty impressive. And because of their stunt, Meridian is going to get federal dollars in 1937 to build their airport. And Key Field, named for the Key boys, will be created. Today, Key Field is used as an aerial refueling center. They have a lot of KC-10s and all these planes out here, these refueler airplanes that fly to Meridian. I see them come across my house all the time. And then all of a sudden, you'll see the big, huge fueler tanker plane take off. And then here goes the F-35s and the F-16s right behind it. They're on a training mission to learn how to refuel these airplanes, flying over Northwest Florida and South Alabama and South Georgia, across the Gulf. And so this is still a major part of it. And these Key boys prove that you can refuel airplanes from the air. And this brought in this new division here that takes care of air refueling. If you go to Meridian Air Terminal, which is not real big, you'll have there's a little museum here in the air terminal that's dedicated to the Key boys. And I've been there several times to the air terminal here in Meridian and seen this display here. So guys, airports, dams, canals will all be put into place here during this time period. It's also in 1934 that the Congress is going to pass a new airplane or new airline act. It's called the Black-McKellar Act. The Black-McKellar Act allows the postal system to extend the airline business. Now, your traditional original airliners, the airline companies were Transwestern Airlines, TWA, American Airways, Northwest Airlines, United Airlines, and Western Airlines. Those were your original airline companies. With this new Black-McKellar Act is going to come airlines like Delta, Continental, Braniff, okay? You'll have Northeast Airlines. You'll have Chicago and Southern that's based out of Memphis during this time period. That's another airline company I looked into when I wrote about Southern Airways. Chicago and Southern merging with Delta in 1953, and people of Memphis wanted Southern to move their headquarters to Memphis and build their airline out of Memphis instead of out of Atlanta. And Southern had gone to Memphis, they've been a major air carrier. Being in Atlanta all these years, Delta and Eastern kept them stifled. Southern couldn't grow the way they wanted to because they did not move to Memphis. If they moved to Nashville, Tennessee, it'd been a different story. And I write about all that in my book, in my manuscript on Southern Airways, how they should have moved to Memphis during this time period after the merger of Chicago and Southern and Delta. Okay? You'll have Continental Airlines being formed during this time period. So you have new airline companies being formed. Do y'all know, guys, that about 1955, we had close to 75 airline companies in the country? Another airline formed this time period was National Airlines out of Miami. They flew into Pensacola and Panama City during the 1950s and 1960s. And so you have these new airline companies being formed after the Black-McKellar Act. And then in 1938, they formed what is called the Civil Aeronautics Board. They put 5 judges that are in charge of hearing airlines trying to obtain new routes, new airplanes, and new fares. And the CAB is going to regulate the airline industry until Jimmy Carter tears it apart in 1979. The airlines will be governed by the Civil Aeronautics Board all during the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and the 1970s. And they're the ones who decided what airline companies would fly to certain cities and made sure the airlines met standards when it came to safety. All right, that's all part of all this stuff here in this time period. So aviation really changed. You know, another problem here is with airplanes themselves. A lot of your airplanes were made out of wood, 2x4s, and out of tin that you make 10 roofs out of. Your Ford Tri-Motors were wooden airplanes with canvas flaps and canvas rudders and canvas ailerons. And they had sheet metal, mostly tin, that made out the fuselage. And these planes had some trouble. In 1931, a Transwestern airplane flying over Kansas or over Iowa fell apart and crashed. The coach at Notre Dame was killed in this accident. It made national headlines. It turned out the plane had termites in it. It dry rotted. And Transwestern Airlines decided they wanted better airplanes. And they sent letters out to 12 manufacturers of airplanes across the country. And here comes Donald Douglas out of Santa Monica, California, which in 2.5 weeks designed a brand new airliner. 2.5 weeks. Here we got a 737 MAX airline that's been grounded for 2 years because they can't figure out what's wrong with it. And they built the DC-3 in 3 weeks. It's totally crazy. They built the DC-1 prototype. It flew real well. They built the DC-2 that carried 14 people, and they sold close to 500 DC-2s. But in 1934, C.R. Smith, the president of American Airlines, wants a better airplane. He wants a plane that they'll have 2 and 2 seating on the airplane, have overhead berths that will fold down into beds, and have a plane that'll carry 21 people during the daytime and carry about 12 people during the nighttime. And here comes the DC-3. And the DC-3 becomes the most popular airliner in world history. Y'all know they built over 12,000 of them. They built most of them for World War II. After World War II, airlines like Southern and Piedmont and Ozark and Trans-Texas and all those guys, they went through about surplus DC-3s from the Air Force, Army Air Corps, and converted them back into airliners. And they flew until the late 1960s. So the DC-9s and the 737s show up. They replaced those old prop planes with brand new jets. Southern went from having 24 DC-3s to having 20 DC-9s in a matter of about 10 months. They did extremely quickly. Went from being a prop airline company to the jets. They kept the old DC-3s for a while. The little towns that couldn't have DC-9s fly into them. The runways were too short. Okay, this DC-3 is going to change aviation. Here comes a gentleman by the name of Juan Trippe. Mr. Trippe in 1928 buys a Ford Trimotor, and he starts flying between Key West and Havana, 75-mile flight. By 1935, he has got flying boats being built by Barton and by Boeing Company that land to take off on water. These flying boats could carry like 50 people, and he started serving the entire Caribbean island hop across the Caribbean. His headquarters was Coral Gables there in Miami. The runway was a bay at Coral Gables. They took off on the water, and he started flying to South America. By 1938, he's carried some of his flying boats over to San Francisco, California, and now he's flying across the Pacific. His flying boats will fly around the world by 1940. He too bought DC-3s. And so the flying boats of the late 1930s, the DC-3s of the 1930s, is going to change aviation. You know, of all the people who flew on airliners in the late 1930s and early 1940s, that 95% of the world's passengers flew on DC-3s. Over at Lockheed, they made the Electra 10A. This is the plane that Amelia Earhart flew and she lost her life in. But it's also an airliner that carried 14 people. And so you have the Lockheed Electras being used during this time period. So there's a lot going on in aviation here. President Roosevelt is convinced that aviation could be an industry that gets America out of the Great Depression, and he really promoted it. In 1938, in 1939, they saw the movement of Hitler across Europe, and they realized a world war was probably going to develop. You know, I really think that FDR and them had gone in there in 1936 and destroyed Hitler. But they let him mature. I believe they decided the best way to win this depression is get Hitler to have a big, huge, major war, and they could end the depression through the war. We don't enter the war until late 1941 when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. But there was warnings all during this time period that Hitler was building an army, a major military group. Eddie Rickenbacker, the head of Eastern Airlines, went over and saw what was going on in Germany. Charles Lindbergh, who flew across the Atlantic Ocean in 1937, be the first man to solo between New York and Paris. He went to Berlin in 1937 and saw what Hitler was up to. And they came in and told President Roosevelt what they had seen. And Roosevelt pretty much told the two men to mind their own business, that he was controlling all this, not them. So it's crazy. And in 1938, they begin to develop through special corporations on bills. They attached military corporations on bills here in Congress, and they took the old Boeing 247 airliner and they developed what is called B-17 bomber. The B-17 bomber looks a lot like the 247 airliner that Boeing built in 1935. They started developing an airplane at North American Aviation that is called the P-51 Mustang. They turned the DC-3 into the C-47 cargo planes. And then Donald Douglas developed a new 4-engine airliner that's called the DC-4. That becomes a C-47 cargo plane during World War II. And so you start seeing this being developed. General Hap Arnold, decided in 1939 that he is going to develop a training program to train American boys how to fly. He says that aviation will play a major role in a new world war, that America needed 400,000 pilots. They started what is called the civilian pilots training schools, the civilian pilot training schools. They went through and hired universities to teach the programs to train pilots in the basics of aviation, to teach them the science of aviation. And then they went across the country and they hired fixed base operators to train the boys, to actually have the flying schools. Our college is doing that right now. We're bringing back the old civilian pilot training schools to Northwest Florida State College. The Crestview Aerospace is going to take care of the training of the pilots. We'll have classes here at the Niceville campus that will have the boys trained in the science of aviation. When the boys get an AA degree and have their pilot's license, they'll go down to Embry-Riddle in Daytona Beach to get their commercial license. So we're back in the old same ball game here, guys. And we'll have new jobs here for the aviators of the future. It's interesting here. You know, Southern Airways, the airline that I wrote about, they started operation from a fixed base operation here in World War II. Frank Hulse, the president of Southern Airways, was 27 years old when he got a contract in Augusta, Georgia, to train war pilots. He's going to train over 42,000 boys for World War II, including Paul Tibbets, who dropped the atomic bomb over Japan in 1945. The boys of the Memphis Belle were trained by Southern Airways of Georgia. And Frank Hulse had over 15 flying schools across the South by 1944. They had training schools from Jackson, Tennessee, down to Decatur, Georgia, Birmingham, Atlanta. They built Rickenbacker Field, which is now Dobbins Air Force Base. They had a school in Greenville, Spartanburg, Charlotte, Camden, South Carolina, Orangeburg, South Carolina, Augusta, Georgia. And it's from that operation that closed in 1945 that he started Southern Airways, the airline company. He came right out of the training school. Tom Davis in North Carolina and Winston-Salem did the same thing. He started what is called Piedmont Aviation. Piedmont will grow into being a major East Coast airline with their base in Charlotte, North Carolina. In the early 1990s, they were bought out by U.S. Airways, and about 10 years ago, they were bought out by American Airlines. And the Charlotte hub was started by Piedmont Airlines. The Memphis hub that Delta now has was started by Southern Airways. So it's interesting, you look at these airline companies that came out of World War II, and a lot of the boys who are trained for Southern are trained by Southern and by Piedmont become their future pilots. Their mechanics who go off to World War II will come home, become part of their maintenance base. So it's interesting how these airlines are developed here out of this area. And President Roosevelt was correct. The airline will become a major industry in America's future. Hey, y'all hush. Okay? So you guys remember what's going on here when it comes to aviation, part of all this stuff. Okay? This came out of the second 100 days in his administration. And then he discovered there's over 5,000 riders who needed jobs. He hired them. He told these riders, I want you guys to write local histories. To write local histories. Well, they got out here, guys, and started writing these histories, and they discovered 100,000 people who were born in slavery. The folks who are 100 years old were born in 1836. They spent almost half of their adult life in slavery. They found slaves that were born in 1840 and 1850. If you were born in 1850, guys, you were enslaved for 15 to 20 years. And they got the stories of these former slaves. It's called the slave narratives. I have learned more history from the slave narratives than from any other source. You guys need to read the slave narratives. The slave narratives, just go to Google and Google the slave narratives. You do it by states. Your encyclopedias that I have on your blackboard, your state encyclopedias, they have links to the slave narratives. And you guys need to read them. If you don't know your history, you're up to repeat it. And these slave narratives were very important findings here in this time period. Okay? So, guys, these writers found the slave narratives. They found these former slaves. They also found children who were involved in the Indian schools and children involved in the orphan trains. And they got their stories. You can learn more history through diaries and from documentary programs, either written or on film, that explains to you American history. There's more than me just talking to you on a Zoom lecture. There's a lot of great stuff out there. Okay? Also, the Writers Project, they started what is called the Music Project. They're going to hire orchestras and bands to tour the country to entertain the American people. FDR realized something. The best way to help the American people through a Great Depression and get their minds off the troubles of the Depression is through entertainment. We had more people going to baseball games. We had more people going to movies, going to concerts in this time period than any other time in American history. And a lot of this was free because the president wanted you to had to have some diversion away from the Great Depression, to have you have 2 or 3 hours in which you were not worried about the Great Depression, that you could be entertained and could be laughing and enjoying yourself. That the American people have to have something to look forward to every day. That's the problem with a lot of world's people. Over in the Middle East, they have nothing to look forward to each day. They need concerts. They need baseball teams. They need football. They need to start competing against each other instead of having war against each other. That's what civilized us, guys, by providing the American people with sports and music and entertainment here during the Great Depression. And so you have the American Music Project, where they hired musicians. And then you have the Actors Program. And they started putting on plays across the country. Broadway shows would go to your hometown here, guys, in this time period. The Maddie Kelly Art Center here in Knoxville, our main campus, they used to have Broadway shows all the time until this pandemic showed up. I saw West Side Story over here at the Maddie Kelly Art Center. And so that brought diversion to the American people by having all these plays. They had Shakespeare plays. They had the plays of Eugene O'Neill being performed here across the country. And people flocked to see all this stuff here because they want to be entertained. They need to be entertained during this time period. Okay? You also had the Federal Arts Project. They hired artists. They went across the country painting beautiful murals of American society, of American culture. They painted murals in airport terminals. They painted murals in high school auditoriums and gymnasiums. They painted murals in train stations. These artists painted thousands of murals here in this time period. In the 1970s, they painted over them. Now we're restoring them by getting the paint off of them. And now we're discovering a lot of this great artwork that was done during the 1930s. You guys can go through and Google the Federal Art Project of the 1930s and see these beautiful paintings they did, these beautiful murals they did across the country here. Okay, so you have the Federal Writers Project, you have the Federal Theaters Project, you have the Federal Art Project, and you had the Federal Music Project. These are all put into place to bring entertainment to the American people, along with your movies and your baseball games, and your basketball games, and your college football games, and so forth. They found a way to keep the American people entertained in the dark years of this Depression. A lot of folks said that Hollywood is what got America out of the Great Depression. You know, Hollywood had about 14 movies a week that were released across the country, 14 movies each week. If you guys watch Turner Classic Movies, there's thousands of movies from the 1930s, thousands of them. Now you get about 4 or 5 movies a week or maybe a month out of Hollywood, and you don't get that much anymore. All right? I think it was the 1930s. So a lot of interesting things going on here. Okay? Now I want to ask you guys a question here. When's the best time? When is the best time to kill Jim Crow? When is the best time to bring equality to all the American people? the Native Americans, the African Americans, the Asian Americans, the Hispanic, Latino Americans. When's the best time to bring equality to the American people? I believe that this is the time to do it. Why didn't FDR get involved in civil rights in the 1930s? He could have killed all this stuff during the Great Depression years, and his wife Eleanor, who was his eyes and ears during this depression, and Eleanor told him, "You're not helping the people who need help. You're showing white supremacy here, and you're not helping minority groups whatsoever, and they need help." To prove her point, she's going to get a young lady whose name is Marian Anderson. She's a soprano, and she wants Marian Anderson to be a light into Black society so a white America can see and hear this young lady perform and see that she is worthy of American society. Eleanor decided to have a concert that involved Marian Anderson. And she decided to rent the concert hall of the American women who are the daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR. And they allowed her to rent that auditorium for Marian Anderson's performances until they discovered that Marian Anderson was Black. And the DAR told Eleanor, the first lady, that she could not use their auditorium for a Black singer. Eleanor was mad as hell about this. And she goes to the Parks Department and she rents out the Lincoln Memorial. And she gets CBS and NBC and Mutual Broadcasting, and they hook up their microphones at the Lincoln Memorial, and Marian Anderson sings here in 1939. And when she sings, over 40 million Americans hear her sing. The First Lady is concerned about Black America. The President could care less. Why was FDR so stubborn when it came to the plight of Black Americans? Because he spent a lot of time in Georgia at Warm Springs. When he got invited to supper or dinner or to parties in Warm Springs, Georgia, who did he get invited by? The middle class Black folks, or the wealthier class? He went to wealthier class households, and he saw the help in action. He saw the Black man who came out to his car and helped him get out of his car and usher him into the house of these white rich folks in Georgia. He saw the maids. He saw the Black cooks. He saw the Black yard boys, as they called them during this time period. These were grown men they called yard boys. And he says, if this works so well for the people of Georgia, why should I interfere in it? I guarantee that he did not talk to any of this help here in this time period. He did not understand what these folks really wanted and what they really needed. He was totally oblivious to the people around him. FDR is guilty of white supremacy. This man of New York State who should have known better, and Eleanor told him, he had nothing to do with the plight of Black Americans. It's no issue to him whatsoever. And he should have looked at these folks and tried to find ways to help them out of sharecropping and out of the problems. You know, guys, the AAA gave the owners of land across the South money for digging up their crops. And they told them that this money was to go to the sharecroppers because these folks would not have an income if they went through and started planting less crops. They wouldn't have a job anymore. And so they told the landowners to give this money to the sharecroppers. How much money did the sharecroppers get here in this time period? Jimmy Carter tells you. These old blue-blooded landowners gave these sharecroppers, both Black and white, exactly zero money once sharecropping was ended because of these New Deal programs in farming. Do you know a whole town developed between Memphis and St. Louis along Highway 61? Over 100,000 refugees off of farms lived in cardboard houses along Highway 61. They got crawfish out of the ditches along the highway to feed themselves. They go to the Mississippi River system and try to catch fish to feed themselves. And nobody cared about it. Nobody went out of their way to help these people. It's sad that they're so oblivious to what's going on around him here when it comes to this time period, to the plights of the poor in this time period. All right? On July the 5th, 1935, they're going to create what is called the National Labor Relations Board. The one behind this program is going to be Frances Perkins. She's the head of the Labor Department. The National Labor Relations Board is trying to find ways to make sure we have no problems with strikes, that labor is being treated fairly here in these new programs. And then, of course, in 1938, they're going to form what is called the Fair Labor Standards Act. The 1938 Fair Standards Labor Act is going to get rid of child labor. It also is going to set a minimum wage in this time period. The minimum wage is going to be 25 cents an hour. When I first started working out of college at Troy University in 1975, the minimum wage was $1.25. That was minimum wage, $1.25 in 1975 when I finished college. I got a job, my first job paid me $3.90 an hour. And yet I paid for an apartment, I bought a car, paid for car insurance, fed myself at that little rate. It's hard to imagine today that people are making $3.90 an hour minimum wage in this time period. Okay? Now, guys, President Roosevelt does have some trouble. He's got two men who criticizes him and his New Deal programs. The first one is named Charles Coughlin. Charles Coughlin is a Catholic priest. He's extremely conservative, and he accuses the president of being a dictator. He says a New Deal program is going to bring a dictatorship to the American people. He is ultra-conservative, and he says that FDR has gotten too much power. 40 million people a week listens to Father Coughlin's radio program. And a lot of people are watching FDR. Either you love him or you hate him in this time period. The other person is named Huey P. Long. Huey Long is from Louisiana. He got his start in the during the First World War, he got his start. He became a commissioner on the Louisiana Commission Board. He traveled the state selling insurance policies. He knew a lot of people from his early work selling insurance policies. He gets on the Civil Commission of Louisiana. And then in the mid-1920s, he becomes governor of Louisiana. In 1932, he's a governor of Louisiana, and he runs for the Senate. He is senator and governor of Louisiana here in the early 1930s. And he is a Roosevelt man in the beginning. By 1934, he says a New Deal is not working. We need to do away with the New Deal programs. And he says it's time for America to share our wealth. Huey Long in 1935 runs for the presidency, and he tells the American people it is time to get rid of the wealthy class. He says the American people should be one class of people. We all should be equal. We should have the same salary and the same housing. Now, this sounds like communism. And Huey Long is going to run for the presidency here in 1935. Well, in September of 35, Huey Long is assassinated at the Capitol in Baton Rouge. He had a brand new group of Secret Service men who watched over him. He goes to the Capitol that morning here in September of 1935 to chastise his senators, his House members, his legislators, if you will, of Louisiana. And here in the hallway, in the downstairs part of the Capitol, in an all marble hallway, marble floor, ceiling, and walls, a dentist approaches him. A little argument kind of breaks out, and one of those bodyguards shoots and kills this dentist. Well, the bullet ricochets around that marble wall, and the bullet goes into the chest of Huey Long. They carry him to the hospital behind the Capitol. It's called Our Lady of the Lake Hospital, and here he died on the operating table. Now, here's what's interesting about all of this. Some more of my personal history. My grandpa's uncle, my grandpa calls his brother, I should say, and his name was Uncle Emmett. He worked at the Capitol building here in Baton Rouge, and he knew Huey Long pretty well. I'm sorry, his name was Abner, Uncle Abner. And Uncle Abner told me, he says, Huey Long was assassinated by Roosevelt. And I said, why do you say that? He says, because several of those men and his entourage and his protection had been newly appointed to protect him by Roosevelt. And a lot of people in Baton Rouge believe that FDR had Huey Long killed to keep him from having political influences in the election of 1935. So it's interesting here when you look at all this stuff and all this history here that takes place in this time period. And a lot of Baton Rouge, as Uncle Abner said, felt like FDR had been assassinated. I mean, that Huey Long had been assassinated through the influences of President Roosevelt in this time period. So who knows what goes on in politics here? You know, we've kind of lost being naive about politicians in America in the last few years. And we realize they're not George Washingtons. You know, they don't always tell the truth. And sometimes they make up lies to cover up for lies and so forth. Richard Nixon was very guilty of all of this stuff here in this time period. So guys, Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin is trying to call out Roosevelt during this time period. And then in 1936, the United States Supreme Court begins to find the New Deal programs unconstitutional. The Supreme Court judges of 1936 had been appointed by Republican presidents. They do not like what Roosevelt, a Democrat, is doing here with the New Deal programs. And they start finding them unconstitutional, doing away with his New Deal programs. And this president gets mad. And he tells these judges, if you do not start treating my New Deal programs to have the American people with respect, I am going to put more judges on the Supreme Court. I'm going to pack the court and go from 9 judges to 15 judges. He says there's about 4 of you people who are on death's door anyway, and when you die, I'll put in Democratic judges to replace you, and then I'll put 6 more judges on the Supreme Court. This is crazy. And he seriously wants to pack the court here to give the Supreme Court more power under his administration. I want to tell you guys here something. If we have a Democratic-controlled Congress with a majority, a Democrat-controlled Senate with a majority, which we had here in this time period, you got a Democratic president with FDR. If he turns the Supreme Court into Democrats, what can FDR turn himself into? A Lord Protector like Oliver Cromwell, or a dictator like Joseph Stalin, or somebody like Adolf Hitler? We could have some real problems here, guys, in this time period. I think about Huey Long if he had won the presidency in 1936. My Lord, could y'all imagine? We'd have fascism and we'd have a Hitler here in the United States if he had won the election here in 1936. Huey Long being assassinated might not have been a bad thing during this time period. Okay? But Roosevelt is going to try to pack the court. Thank God his Senate told him no. The American Senate would not hear of this. And so FDR was never able to pack the Supreme Court. You know, after the election of 1936, he took office again in 1937 on March, this time in January the 20th. And this time, FDR decides to pull back on the New Deal programs. Let's see how good we're doing with the New Deal. Within months, the Great Depression returned. We realize here in 1937, with the Roosevelt recession, that the Great Depression is not ending with the New Deal programs. It is going to take something larger than the New Deal to end the Great Depression. And all eyes are being turned toward Germany. and what Hitler's up to during this time period. Okay? On the next lecture, we're going to talk about Adolf Hitler going across Germany and going across Europe and building his Third Reich. We're going to discuss the problems in Japan and what's going on, introduce the war itself, and then try to get into the particulars of World War II. Okay, and this completes lecture number 8.